Let's work on another intuitive watercolor painting, starting with the bilateral drawing technique. When you make your initial marks using the colored pencil, notice the way that you hold your pencil and try to loosen up your grip on the pencil. I want you to kind of think of when you were a kid and you were first learning how to use a pencil in the first place, and you kind of held it in all different ways to see what felt comfortable. And so do that and just let the pencil guide you in making random marks. And notice when the inner critic starts to come up and says these marks are ugly or these marks aren't going to work. Trust the mark making. I'm starting off with a thick and heavy pigmented line of watercolor and then blending it out into the paper and into clean water. You don't see me washing my brush in between each stroke here, but I am washing my brush and using clean water as I pull the green pigment out into the paper. And eventually, as I go, you'll start to see me create a nice fade into nothing. And it's creating this beautiful fade. And so what you're not seeing is that I am cleaning my brush in between each of these moments of me fading in and blending. So you want to make sure you have access to clean water. And I wasn't planning on utilizing whatever this technique is throughout the whole piece, but I had such an amazing time doing it. It felt so good sensorily that I just kept going with it. And it took me to a place that I definitely wasn't expecting in terms of the process and the outcome, but it was a really soothing, predictable technique and process that was just right for my nervous system. And that's the thing, you have to pay attention to what the art is trying to tell you. And if you're trying to tell the art what to do too much, if you're trying to micromanage the process and the flow, then the flow isn't going to produce as much of a loose and free painting as you might want. If this is your first time getting into intuitive painting, it makes sense that you might be tense or holding a lot of tension in the process. So don't be too hard on yourself if the first several paintings that you do feel frustrating and you have a hard time tapping in. What we want to do in the early stages of learning to paint from your intuition is to gather data, however you want to say it. Gather information about your process, how your brain works during the intuitive process. If you go into it saying, I'm not doing this right, I can't do this, I don't have the brain for it, no way, my brain's too loud, everything I create through the intuitive process sucks, I have to have a plan and a composition, that is a form of your inner critic. That is your perfectionist letting you know you can't do this because you can't do it right away, so you better give up so that you don't end up failing. And your perfectionist just wants to protect you from making bad art and failing and doing things wrong. And what we're trying to retrain your brain and your mind to think about through this process is that everything that you do that's a mistake is information on how to go about it the next time. If you never make mistakes with your art process, if you never get frustrated or creatively blocked, or if you never get caught in the loop of comparison, then you might not ever learn, and you might just operate from this place of ego and limit and hinder your creative process in terms of how it can be therapeutic for you and not just an ego boost for you. And I think that's a question we all have to ask ourselves at one point or another in our creative process is, am I doing this because I want to be known as the best artist in the world? Or am I doing this because I want art to be a means of healing and processing and communicating what otherwise might not be processed, felt, or communicated? And maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe there's a part of you that wants to be the best artist in the world, but also wants to utilize art in a healing way. But if one overpowers the other, specifically the ego, specifically the part that wants to be the best artist in the world, it might make that therapeutic processing feel impossible or feel blocked. And so these little practices, even if you are an oil painter or a photographer or a sculptor, these painting sessions with watercolor paint and just allowing yourself to have no limits, no rules, no outcome expectations, everything in your art process, whatever you do, will loosen up and will feel more accessible They're literally small meditations for your creative process. Use what comes up during these sessions, just like you would in therapy sessions. If you go into a therapy session and your therapist gives you lots of information and you just go and use that information to beat yourself up, rather than using that information to evolve and grow and learn and introspect, then therapy would not be effective. And so this art process will only be effective if you allow what comes up in them to be information that you do not shame yourself for, you do not judge yourself for. You evolve from it. That information and you ask yourself, what did this session today have to tell me? And if you were frustrated the whole time and you hated the outcome of what you did, or you found yourself not being able to loosen up, that is information about where you're at. And so you can ask yourself 3 questions, and these are questions I use with my therapy clients and my previous therapist had used with me in times where I wasn't sure how to check in with myself and where I was at. So you can ask yourself, this can be something you ask both before and after your creative session. It can be questions you ask yourself during, but try to keep it to these 3 questions and try to answer all 3, not just 1 or 2. So the questions are, how am I feeling? Or what feelings are most present for me right now? So that's question 1. 2 different versions of the question. How am I feeling? Or what are these feelings that are present for me right now? What are the feelings that are present for me right now? Second question, what am I telling myself about those feelings? Or another way of asking, what narratives are coming up around the feelings that I'm experiencing? Third question, what do I need right now in this moment? And if that's too hard to answer, then what would be most loving for me in this moment right now? So let's apply those questions to my process right here. So what am I feeling? During this process, I was feeling relaxed, loose, and curious. What am I telling myself about those feelings? I'm telling myself that I'm not sure if I am relaxing too much and if I'm going to end up just hating this. And even though there was a sense of ease in this process, I did notice a lot of the self-judgment and criticism in the background trying to tell me that this wasn't as cool as I thought it was, or that I'm getting too excited. Don't let yourself like it too much. It's probably going to be, a terrible outcome. So there was a lot of background noise. And what did I need, or what would have been most loving for me in that moment? And it was to just allow myself to love whatever I created and to allow myself to also hate whatever I created. And I did allow that. I did let that happen through this process. So use those questions during your creative process as a checkpoint to see where you're at, to see what you might need, and to notice which one of those questions are the most difficult for you to answer. Noticing if any of them feel impossible to answer, or notice if there's any judgment coming up about asking yourself those questions, or any resistance coming up about asking yourself those questions. But of all of this, the biggest tip I can give you is to just keep going until you're done. Even if it means at the end just pouring a bunch of color over the page and destroying what you created, allowing yourself to be finished in the creative process and to not walk away from the creative process feeling open and like you didn't get to fully close what was coming up. And that's why these sessions are so different than a regular painting session, because the idea is that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's done in the entire one sitting session, and you're not left with this piece that you're left thinking about. And so allowing yourself to finish the piece, to push through the parts of the piece that you don't like, or especially when you feel like I messed it up, it's screwed up beyond repair. Okay, but can you finish it? But can you make one final mark that allows you to empower yourself to take your power back over the feeling that the art was a waste or the art was no good? Allow yourself to claim ownership and to say there was a reason and a purpose in creating this bad art today. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you love what you create, you also use that as information. Why do I love this painting or this process today, where other days I've hated it or I've hated the process? What was different? Use each intuitive painting session as an information gathering session, an information processing session. It is a time for you to fully go through your creative process when you have no rules and expectations, so that you can learn your baseline. I think these sessions really give me a baseline of how I'm showing up to my creative process. Without any other information based off these sessions, I can tell myself during the week, was I blocked? Was I frustrated? Was I open? Was I expressive? And you can Use it as information instead of using it as a shame tactic or a judgment tool. See, everything I created this week was bad, awful, I'm a shit artist is so much different than, wow, this week I created art I hated the entire week. What was that about? So it's about being curious and gathering information. So that's like the theme of today's intuitive talk and healing talk as I work through this. It's just really important that we understand ourselves as creatives and don't assume that we know everything about ourselves just because we've been doing something our whole lives, or just because we're new at something doesn't mean that we don't know anything or that we don't come in already with these natural talents. And so you might come in and say, I'm self-taught, I've never done anything creative before. And then you find out as you go that you have so much more natural talent than you ever thought. So regardless of the information that you gather, just make sure you don't use it to be hard on yourself, to punish yourself, to demean yourself, or degrade yourself as an artist. So coming back to the actual painting I'm working on here, and you can see it kind of went in this interesting direction. I had to let each layer dry beneath the next layer before I could move on. Otherwise, I wouldn't get this layered effect. A hallmark tip of watercolor is to make sure that you let your layers dry. And I know that that can be such a challenge for those of us with ADHD or those of us with just no patience at all, but I promise. And even if it means just getting a blow dryer or a fan and having that next to you so you can dry each layer more expeditiously, that's fine. But that will also be information, right? Am I trying to rush through my process? Do I ever let my layers dry? Do I struggle letting my layers dry? And being curious rather than judgmental. So things I didn't like about this painting, I didn't end up liking that connection in the middle that I made. At first I thought it was really cool and I liked it, and then as the painting went on I started to hate it. So I kept trying to work it out and give it more dimension, and I considered covering it up, but I ended up just keeping it and going with it and thinking it might be somebody else's favorite part of the painting. So you can see on this part right here where there were parts that weren't fully dry yet. And so you can see where there's the hard dark line and then where the green paint kind of washes out into the white. Where it washes out into the white shows you where it wasn't completely dry. The only time you're going to be able to get those really defined lines is if you're working with wet on dry technique. The wet on wet technique is always going to create some type of washout with the paint because it is going to spread because the water activates it so much. You're learning technical skill through this process. You're learning intuitive skill through this process. You're learning about your mental health through this process. If you enjoyed this video, please like, please subscribe. I'm so new to this YouTube world and I have no idea if this type of content is going to hit. But I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you're with me. If you have any questions or feedback, please leave them in the comments section below and I'll be sure to get back to you. I'm so proud of you for being here. I truly am. To be in this creative journey together in a time like this means everything. And don't forget to be proud of yourself for showing up and noticing if it's hard to be proud of yourself or if it feels icky to be proud of yourself or if it even feels icky to hear me say that I'm proud of you. That's information. So thanks for being here, and I will be back soon with another intuitive painting session.